Was it pretty compelling? Was it something that you think people are crazy to struggle with, or do you think that have you struggled with understanding that Jesus exists? Give me some feedback on how you took last week's talk about the existence of Jesus.
Well, it has to do with truth.
Okay.
And I just can't believe that they can listen to historians or read historians and throw it all out.
Yeah.
If they're willing to believe that Alexander the Great, that he conquered the known world, that he died at the age of 29, probably poisoned, that because he conquered the known world, he taught everybody to read and speak Greek. I have no idea whatever he wrote, if he ever wrote anything. So, why, if they're willing to accept that, I think we missed a boat, or they missed a boat early on when they should have called it the early history instead of the Bible. And people would have accepted it a lot more.
I see. It's good. I like it. Thanks for that feedback, Walton. Other thoughts, comments on this? Do you encounter the existence of Jesus as an issue when you talk to people online or face to face? He was a prophet. But they don't, the people that you've encountered haven't said yet that they don't think he exists. Okay. Wayne?
One thing I hear a lot is Jesus was a good man, but he wasn't God. And I ask, does a good man habitually and continually lie? Is that a good man?
Yeah.
Because he claimed to be God. The Jews knew he claimed to be God because they picked up stones to stone him because what he said proclaimed that he was God.
Yeah.
You know, so is he a liar
Yeah.
and a good man?
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense. Because I like what C.S. Lewis said.
Yeah.
He's either a liar, a lunatic, or he's who he said he was.
That's right. That's good. So that's perfect. Well articulated, famous line by Lewis, Lord, liar, lunatic, right? I'm sure many of you have come across that. If you haven't yet, that's kind of like the key base point nugget of apologetics, to start with. It's a really good thing to check out. So just Google Lord, liar, lunatic, and you'll learn more about it. In fact, we're going to be covering essentially Lord, liar, lunatic, this trilemma, if you will, in this class. We just aren't necessarily referring to it in those exact words. Other thoughts, feedbacks on Jesus' existence stuff? Yeah.
So, as a former atheist, I just kind of assumed that Jesus was real, but I didn't really question it. And then, of course, when I became a Christian, I believed it because I was a Christian. I had to, right? And now, as an agnostic, since the last week, I've been doing a lot of study from some of the stuff that you gave me. So I'm in the process of giving it an honest look again, just from the point of view of the Savior.
Okay.
So that's, I'm still not done yet. But
Okay.
you gave me a lot of good stuff to refer to. So.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. Yeah, very cool.
Jesus is a God.
People say that Jesus is a God. Ah, I see. Yeah. Yeah. In an Indian context, I bet that's said a lot, yeah? Yeah. Very good. Well, why don't we talk about the Messiah evidence tonight? We have probably a couple outlines we can go through this evening. We'll see how it goes. If we get through this one, we'll start the psychological evidence outline a little later on here. Okay, so let's just kind of play it by ear. So this is picking up in the Messiah evidence part of your book there. Again, it's easily found with the tabs on the side, and you can follow along with us that way. I believe it's actually up in the upper right-hand corner, page 74.
I just want to give a big thank you for this.
All right.
Really appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Chris. Page 74 in the upper right-hand corner, and we'll start on page 1 of 9. Is that right? 1 of 9? All right, great. So Let me ask you a question. Have you ever heard of this story? It starts off like this. A long time ago in a land far, far away, there was a Jedi prophecy that one day a chosen one would come to bring balance to the Force. Has anyone heard of this? Lord of the Rings, right? I know, I'm just messing with you. Lord of the Rings, of course. So, so the prophecy in Star Wars kind of makes the movies, right? If it wasn't for this idea that one would come one day to right the wrongs and to bring justice and harmony back to the entire cosmos, then Star Wars wouldn't be what it is. Star Wars would lose so much of its fire, the fire that kind of seems to burn in our hearts, that we connect with. There's this passionate movement, if you will, that opens up each one of those movies. It's a movement that we somehow resonate with. It's a movement that we know very well in the depths of our soul, that there's one person that would one day show up, a hero, if you will, someone who comes to right the wrongs, someone who's like a human, but so much better, who doesn't seem to struggle with the same things we do. And it's interesting that in our very advanced technological age that we live in the Western world, that hero movies are coming out 3 or 4 times a year. Hollywood is spending millions and billions of dollars now, especially in the last, say, 15, 20 years, to bring us the hero movies. Avengers, X-Men, Superman, Batman. Although Batman doesn't really have any superpowers, just to be technically accurate here. What else? Am I missing anybody? Now there's a Flash Gordon TV show, right? Flash Gordon. What other movies am I? Spider-Man. Yeah. And on and on and on. And these hero movies, they speak to us. We connect with them so easily. Now, my wife happens to be the biggest superhero movie fan of them all. Her favorite is Transformers. Believe it or not, although much anticipation, after about 2 minutes in Transformers, she walks out of the movie theater. Where are you going? She just walks up like, I can't handle talking car robot things, alien things. I'm like, what do you mean? Of course they talk. They're Transformers. So anyway, but there's something about these people coming, these aliens or these creatures, these mutants, whatever they are. Superman's an alien, and they come from outer space and they land here on Earth and they seem like they have human characteristics to them. They speak, they talk, they're rational creatures, super strength, whatever. And they seem to be coming to help us right our wrongs and bring balance to the Force, bring justice to the cosmos. Interestingly, this is the story of the Old Testament. And come to find out, the New Testament. The Old Testament is filled with prophecy. And it's not extremely explicit. It's not, there will be a man one day called Jesus, and he will live, die, and this, that, and the other. But it's implicit. And the few who have the ears to hear, so to speak, can listen and hear it and receive it. So that's where we're picking up today. And many non-Christians don't recognize the miraculous nature of fulfilled prophecy, especially when it comes to Jesus. So people that are not Christian, they say things like, Jesus fulfilled the prophecies by accident. By accident. Or they may say things like, Jesus intentionally fulfilled the prophecies so that he would be the Messiah. He did it on purpose. He knew what they were, and that's why the gospel writers, the evangelists, said that he did this to fulfill this prophecy. They explicitly say this was done to fulfill this prophecy. And some non-Christians even say that Christians ripped off passages and took them out of context from the Jewish Bible, from the Old Testament. Christians stole these Jewish ideas to use them to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. So non-Christians flat out reject the miracle that we bring up when we're talking about fulfilled prophecy. So we're asking tonight, did Jesus and Jesus alone match the identity of the prophesied Messiah? When you look at it closely, technically, was he the only one who has matched it? Is it possible that someone else could have? Well, let's look at it a little bit. By the way, in the item here under Messiah evidence, there's a thing that says interview, number 6. Does prophecy support Jesus as Messiah? You can watch this interview on JesusFactOrFiction.com. In fact, at the break, I may bring it up. But when you see interview here in any of the notes, go to JesusFactOrFiction.com, and there's a group of scholars. I don't know how many different scholars, but they all present a good 2 or 3 minute little video, and they do it really well in a very quick way. It's kind of like a Case for Christ sort of thing where you're getting to be face to face with these scholars. JesusFactOrFiction.com, all one word. Factorfiction.com. JesusFactOrFiction.com. Now, the Messiah is a Jewish word. I think it's pronounced Mashiach. Help me with this. Mashiach? Mashiach. Hawking loogies here. And in the Greek, the Greek word for this Hebrew word Messiah is Christ. So Christ is not Jesus' last name. So Jesus was not born to Joseph and Mary Christ. He happens to be called Jesus the Messiah, or the Jewish word for Jesus, Yeshua, right? Sounds like Joshua. Yeshua, Mashiach. There you go. So Yeshua comes into the picture in this movement, if you will, in this grand story. There's already scene 1, scene 2, scene 3 that has unfolded. And now Jesus comes in, scene 4. And there's already this movement and dialogue happening, this poetry, if you will, based on the history of Israel. And he enters the scene, and he is the anointed one. So Messiah means the anointed one. He's the expected one whom they hoped for. So when you talk about the anointed one, you're talking about a chosen one. We use the word anoint when we talk about anointing oil, or we talk about a special gifting from the Holy Spirit. We say that pastor, that preacher is anointed, or he's just really gifted in a way. Well, Jesus is not just anointed or gifted or special. It's the special one, the anointed one. So if you will, think of it as we all could be anointed, so to speak, in our own spiritual gifting with a lowercase a. Jesus is the capital A, the anointed one. And I know I'm spending time on this, maybe, and it's annoying because maybe you've heard this, but it's interesting that Christians, we hear this in sermons and we look past it real quick. But I want us to go through the evidence for his messiahship tonight, because I think it adds so much value to everyone in the room on our own apologetics journey. And I know it did for me. And so by getting really, really familiar with this stuff tonight, I know you may be cursory familiar with it based on just hearing it here and there in Sunday morning services, but by getting really familiar with it tonight, I guarantee you will enjoy and use this in your own evangelistic efforts. So when we're talking about the Messiah and the anointed one, we're talking about the one they hoped for. So if you think about hope today, we think about how much we all need hope in our world, but the Israelites had this sense of hope that was very existential in nature. It was part of who they were. It was their makeup. Just as we saw last class that the Hebrew Tanakh was the part of Israel, like more than our Constitution is here for America. The Tanakh was everything to them. And so when we pick up the story of Jesus, we're picking it up from the time of the Maccabean period, where the Maccabean people revolted. If you remember last class, we talked about Judas Maccabeus a little bit. In these silent years that Protestants like to say, these 400 years before Christ came, these 400 years where Rome was occupying Jerusalem. And the Jews were still subjected to a foreign authority and basically regulating them in every way, shape, and form except for their religious practices. And so after the Maccabeans came and threw out the Greek rulers who were occupying the temple and had, like we talked about before, roasted a pig on the temple altar in 160 BC, the Maccabees came in and got rid of them and pushed them out of there. So there was a revolution that happened. The people threw out the governing authority. I think the king, if you will, of the land at the time was the Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes. And he was the descendant of Alexander the Great's general who took over that region. If you remember, Alexander the Great went all the way to Persia. They divided up his empire, the Greek Empire, after he died, to 4 different generals. And this ruler was a descendant of one of those generals. And so once the Maccabees got rid of the Greek rulers and the authorities that were in Jerusalem, they started to reinvigorate the priestly life and the priesthood in Israel. And then all of a sudden Rome comes in after a period of peace. And by the way, they actually made a pact with Rome. The Maccabean, Simon Maccabeus, Judas Maccabeus' brother, made a pact with Rome. There was a time of real peace. And so Rome grew to such a great authority that they wound up just bringing the sword to all of these lands. And I think that had to do more with Julius Caesar's reign. And so by the time Jesus enters the scene, there's this incredible tension where you had these moments of revolution that were springing up and then dying down and springing up and dying down to revolt against Rome, to get rid of this external authority that has come in to rule. And these revolution moments were coming from a people group known as the Zealots. You may remember hearing about the Zealots in Israel. The Zealots were shown in the recent episode of AD on Sunday. Did anybody watch that? They came to talk to Peter after he denied Christ and after Jesus was in the tomb, put in the tomb. And the Zealots said, "Join us." They came into the room with John, Peter, and Mary there. "Join us. This is your chance. You guys, your leader has fallen, but we can use you in our zealot revolution." And some scholars have now written some books that try to argue that Jesus was a zealot, and that was who he actually was. It was all about the kingdom coming that he talked about. It was a true kingdom, but of course they killed Jesus. So the scholars who think that Jesus was a zealot obviously are not evangelical. But it's an interesting theory to entertain.
Sorry.
Yes?
Which group of Jews killed Jesus are responsible for Jesus? Is it the Zealots you're saying?
No, I was saying the Zealots were interested in taking back Jerusalem and getting rid of the Roman rulers.
Is there any group of Jews those are against Jesus? Or
No, they were only against Rome, and they wanted to physically get rid of the Romans with war, just like the Maccabees got rid of the Greek leaders in 100, 200 years before that. So the Zealots were just a new name for that. And so when Jesus enters the scene, there's this great tension, and everyone knows about the Zealots. It's kind of like the revolutionaries of the American war, the American war against the the Revolutionary War. So the Zealots, though, weren't successful, obviously, and eventually Roman rule came in, and with all these uprisings that kept coming, Roman authorities essentially destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. So the Zealot motive was destroyed. It was done away with. There were no more Zealots after that. And then, of course, Israel scattered around all of Europe and the Middle Eastern region up until 1947 or whatever it was, after World War II. So there's a little bit of the background trying to show this tension that exists there. So when we talk about hope, we're talking about a national hope to overthrow the authorities, to get rid of Rome, to take back their land, to cleanse the temple, and do whatever they want to do. And this is where Jesus comes in. So you may have heard this before, but the reason why we wanted to go over that background is because it really does inform the significance of these prophecies. So when we pick up this PowerPoint here, we're picking it up with the three ideas of the prophet, the priest, and the king. Jesus comes in as a leader of Israel, essentially, and says, I am now fulfilling these Hebrew offices of rule and reign. I'm fulfilling the prophet office, I'm fulfilling the priestly office, and I'm fulfilling the kingship office. So the prophets of Israel had an office, so to speak. Like we have 3 branches of government now, these were essentially the 3 branches of the Hebrew government in the Old Testament. The prophets were the ones who spoke wisdom and knowledge and truth to the kings and the priests at the time and the people of Israel. And so Jesus is considered the prophet, the one true prophet, the anointed, expected, hoped for prophet. He was the word of God and voice of change to Israel. So he was the one they waited for in terms of the ultimate prophet. And then he was the priest. He was the perfect priest who ushered in the new covenant. And this is highly significant, especially in that time, because the priests were all they had. When Judas Maccabeus took back the temple and threw out the Greek authorities, the priesthood was all that was recovered. They didn't have kings or prophets. It was just the priests. So Judas Maccabeus, Simon Maccabeus were considered the high priest, like Caiaphas was in Jesus' time. So the priests were all that Israel had, but Jesus says, I'm coming in, I'm the new priest. I'm the only priest you need. The king. So Jesus ultimately is the king. So he was the great leader of Israel, taking them and the Gentiles to the promised land where God rules. Now, N.T. Wright, a famous biblical scholar in the United Kingdom, just wrote a book about God being king and this happening through Jesus. So I would check that out. I think it's called The Forgotten King or something like that. And N.T.
He'll be king. What is the second coming, or even the first coming? He had some.
Yeah. So his reign as king starts with the first coming, and we're in this kind of now and not yet kingdom that we live in. I'm sure you've heard that expression where we have the reign of God in our midst. He rules and reigns. However, we're still not quite there yet in terms of his kingdom being ultimately fulfilled in our midst. So, the genealogies of Jesus, next on your outline there. Matthew 1 and Luke 3 have 2 different genealogies, and critics like to pick these genealogies apart because they are not, in fact, identical, and they're very different. And scholars throughout the last 2,000 years have tried to identify the reason for their differences. What was Luke's reason for differing from Matthew so much? And if you look at the genealogies, you'll see that the names that Luke gives do not match the name Matthew gives. Now, there's no reason to get concerned as if there's a immediate contradiction. All Matthew's trying to do is point out 14 generations between each name. So when when Matthew gets to the name David in his genealogy, he is getting to David at a significant point. I believe David is the 14th name listed and the 14th generation from Adam. And so David then is 14 and 14 away in those different respects. And the 7 is apparently God's number. So by having 2, you have 2 7s, you have 14. And 2 may be an indicator or symbolic of the second person of the Trinity or something like this. So when the prophecies in Isaiah say that he's of the branch of David, or comes from the lineage of David, this is the significance of King David. And King David is really known as the king in Israel. It's kind of like our Abraham Lincoln, if you will. Yes, Sharon. Yeah, that's a great point. Scholars in the past have contended that Matthew follows the genealogy of Mary, I believe, and Luke follows the genealogy of Joseph. So, and it's worth looking into. I have not looked into that myself in particular, but I think that is true. Okay, so genealogy of Jesus shows he is the one who the Bible points to as the main character. So the Old Testament points to Jesus, the New Testament points to Jesus. Jesus is the main character of the story. He's what it's all about. Okay? Now the entire Old Testament is filled with types anticipating the coming Messiah. So when we talk about types, we're talking about something that goes along the lines of this phrase, types and shadows. Types and shadows. So you know in literature, if you're reading a fiction book, they're talking, when you hear about the foreshadowing that happens in prior chapters, and it's fulfilled, essentially manifested, if you will, in later chapters, this is what we're talking about when we say shadows. We're talking about a foreshadowing that happens in the Old Testament through these types. This is a word that scholars have used in the past centuries, so don't let it bother you. Types and shadows are imperfect in the Old Testament, but find their perfection in Jesus, who was the ultimate antitype. So again, this is just a word that scholars use. It doesn't mean antichrist, it just means antitype. He's the fulfillment of the type. So where there's a prophecy or something implied, Jesus fulfills it in this antitype fashion. Now here are some human types of Jesus in the Old Testament. You have Adam, you have Noah, Melchizedek, Isaac, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, David. All these guys are essentially types that Jesus is the antitype for. So when we talk about Joseph being put down in or going through all this persecution and different things like that, he's favored by his father, different things like that. This is Joseph in Genesis, by the way. Then Jesus is the antitype of that. Moses is the covenant giver. Jesus is the covenant giver. David is the main king of Israel, kind of the pinnacle point where Israel is in its golden age, if you will. And Jesus is, in the same way, that sort of ruler who brings that sort of golden age reign to us today. Adam, of course, Jesus is the second Adam Paul talks about so eloquently throughout his writings. So, and on and on. So Jesus is the antitype for these human types. Now, here are some other types that are very significant, showing the significance of the sacrificial death of Jesus. So where you have sacrificial death happening in the Old Testament, Jesus fulfills that, or he manifests that in his own life. The animals animals slain by God to provide coats of skin for Adam and Eve. You see that in Genesis 3:21. So you have this initial killing, if you will, of the animals to provide comfort and protection for Adam and Eve. And essentially that's fulfilled in a way by Jesus. Jesus is sacrificed to provide ultimately comfort and protection for Christians. Genesis 8:20 and Ephesians 5:2, the sweet-smelling, talk about the sweet-smelling sacrifice offered by Noah. Again, type, antitype. Genesis 22, Romans 8, the ram offered by Abraham in place of Isaac on Mount Moriah. Again, type, antitype there. So Jesus is ultimately the sacrifice that Abraham was a foreshadow for. Abraham and Isaac were foreshadowing. The Passover lamb, first offered in Egypt, obviously Jesus is the antitype for that. Exodus 12, 1 through 28, you see that there. And so you can also see in Isaiah 53:7, Christ is a lamb led to be slaughtered, just like the Passover lambs were. In the Old Covenant, John 1:29 talks about Christ, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So that's obviously a very important thing for Christians, that he was the ultimate sacrifice. 1 Peter 1:19, he was the precious blood of Christ the Lamb. So you see that there are significant expressions of fulfillment throughout the New Testament. And Leviticus 1 through 7 talks about the Levitical sacrifices, the priesthood in the Old Testament set up for the temple while the Israelites were wandering around in the desert. And the Levitical sacrifices were instituted by God and not man. And so this is something that God set up, a covenant that he established for the priesthood there. And so these are also fulfilled in the New Testament. All throughout here you could see Hebrews 9, 10. These sacrifices in the Old Testament could not bring spiritual cleansing. They weren't enough. The sacrifices, again, 1 Corinthians 5:7, the sacrifices did not point forward to the perfect and efficacious sacrifice of Christ. Now, Genesis 15:6, Abraham believed God. And then you have Romans 3:25, Christ was an atoning sacrifice. Hebrews talks about these sacrifices need to be accompanied by genuine faith from the offerer. Then on the basis of Christ's future work, the believing offerer would be justified. And so you see here that there's just this significant theme of this story throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. This story is all about Jesus. It's all about what he is doing and what he has come to do. He enters the picture to bring balance to the force, so to speak. The ultimate one, and he takes away the sin of the world. And so that's the idea here with this first portion. Any questions, comments on this? Chris?
I'm not sure if you can answer this in one sentence or a minute or whatever, but as we know it, we have what they call Messianic scriptures or verses or songs. But when we talk to Jews, they will refute it and say that's not a Messianic. So I guess my question is why is there this difference between us and them? And how did we label, this verse is a Messianic verse? And why don't they realize that? Or we, they'll say, you guys are implying that.
Whew, wow. Anybody want to start that and see if we can group answer it? Julie?
I think that what we see in the Old Testament as Messianic prophecies, they also see as Messianic prophecies. They just say Jesus isn't the one. But they do interpret the Messianic prophecy as one. I mean, maybe not every single one, but I believe most of them.
They
might be in denial when you're talking to them because they don't know how to deal with it.
And I've asked them, I said, well, then how do you guys, what Messiah were you looking for when he comes? How will you know it's him? And I don't know if they have an answer, but I'd asked them, I said, well, we know he's the Messiah, but how will they know when he comes? Well, what is the sign for them? And they don't, none of them answered me, but just
Go ahead, Jack.
I think the one thing they're looking for is rebuilding of the temple and peace. And so that's where Antichrist could fulfill that and dupe them. So
So they'll think the Antichrist is the Messiah.
Yeah,
Is that what you're saying?
It could. I mean, they're looking for the fulfillment of peace on earth and a rebuilt temple. That's a big thing.
So if Jews fall for the Antichrist, does God still save them? If God shows the equal power to Jews, are they still saved?
Do they stay in that state?
Great question. So that question is a little, well, to unpack it, you said two questions. What happens to those who are not Christian but are Jewish? Do all Jews go to heaven? Sort of thing. Do all dogs go to heaven? By default, they're God's chosen people. No, I didn't mean that Jews were dogs. You guys are terrible. Jeez. What is this? Get your mind out of the gutter. That's so bad of you. So, right, I mean, and then obviously what happens there if people do turn and convert to following the Antichrist, what happens there? So I don't want to necessarily go down that road, but those are great questions. Back to your first question, it seems to me that Jews vary just as much as Christians do in their system of beliefs. If you ask a Jewish scholar, you're going to get a different answer than if you ask a Jew who just has been going to synagogue his whole life, and doesn't really care too much. So it's tough, I think many would just deny that those are messianic prophecies. Many would say they are messianic prophecies, but Jesus didn't fulfill them. Or some would say some are messianic prophecies and some are not messianic prophecies. And then and some of these we'll talk about here together.
How can I know for sure which ones are?
Well, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Yeah. Let's go here. Yeah, Lisa.
I went to a Seder that was given by a Messianic, he was a rabbi, and he went through all the different things in the Seder, the Jewish Seder, but he explained it because it was in a Christian church. But there was a Jewish lady that was in the service who was listening to all this. And when it was all done, she went up to him and said, this was never explained to me ever in this. We didn't know this and we didn't see it. And so, I don't know if they really see, as you said, in a regular service, where they're even getting that information.
Yeah.
If they dig deeply themselves, maybe they don't get it.
Did everybody hear that okay in the back? Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. If a Jew goes to a Christian version of a Seder dinner, this particular lady said that she's never even heard of all of these symbols that were fulfilled by Jesus. So, yeah, I've heard that too, that many Jews go through their whole lives reading or hearing the Tanakh being read in the synagogue, but never realizing that there were prophecies about Jesus at all. They didn't even know there was such a thing. So maybe they didn't go to the Sunday school class, after the synagogue service was over, or a midweek sort of thing like this. I don't know, but maybe they do talk about it if people go and dig deeper. I know there's some Jewish Sunday school classes that are provided as a podcast. You could actually just search any podcast player and listen to some Jewish teaching in a synagogue. It's pretty cool. So yeah, I think it just varies. Maybe place to place, person to person, how they understand or hear about these prophecies. Yeah, Chris.
Do you know if, since after Jesus came, crucified, all of that, was there a change in Jewish tradition from what they used to practice versus what they practice today?
No, not at all. I mean, the Jews that became Christians definitely changed their practices, but from what I understand, no, they kept on trucking along. Yeah.
Well, the big change is when the temple was destroyed, they had to reinvent Judaism to have no temple. So I don't know exactly all the things they came up with, but they really did have a big change and sort of reinvent the practices.
They no longer practice sacrifices.
Right, because they could not do the sacrifice.
Yeah, so but it didn't have anything to do with Jesus. The changes in those practices had everything to do with them being scattered and the temple being destroyed.
So they still believe like the Messiah's coming in.
Yeah, and there are some, there's a sect of Jews in Jerusalem, you could read about them on the news probably every day, who want to start up the sacrifices on the Temple Mount again in Jerusalem, as they were done in the Old Testament. So that's there again, the tension in Jerusalem is tangible. If you've ever been there, who has felt the tension in the place knows what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's like tangible. You could feel it. Okay, let's go a little further here. Oh, let's go to Jack.
I want to say that there's a growing amount of Jewish people coming to faith in Yeshua, Jesus, and all over the world, in Israel included. And there's probably a lot of closet believers, especially in Israel. So it's great, you know. He's working in the hearts and minds of Jewish people, and yeah.
It's really cool. In fact, this whole ministry, the reason why we're here is because we heard about how cool the teaching was here about bringing to the forefront all of the types and shadows in the Old Testament about the life of Jesus, and how incredibly amazing it is to walk through that. So Sarah and I came here because of this very topic that we're on tonight. So yeah, and that's what some of these resources are. So if you've never been up to check out this table, definitely check it out.
Oh,
Yeah.
question. Why couldn't the animal sacrifices do the cleansing?
Well, they did for a year. The offerer brings his heartfelt sorrow to the sacrifice, and for that 1 year, their sins were temporarily pushed aside. Yeah. But it wasn't ultimately forgotten, or their cleansing was always a temporary sort of thing.
It was probably the value of the animal wasn't, human is more valuable than an animal.
Right, yeah.
Part of it.
That's why we're going to sacrifice Chris afterwards. Yeah. He's a very valuable guy. Okay, actually with that, we'll go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back in in about 5-10 minutes, and we'll talk more about the specific prophecies, okay? If you don't have a book, please get a book in the hallway for $10. They're optional, but if you want one, they're there for you. Why don't we go ahead and start, and then maybe 5 minutes later, this guy will start talking. We'll cue to him. Okay, so we're talking about, we're in letter H there. Some of the types of the old, oh no, we did that, sorry. Letter I. Here are some of the most commonly referred to fulfilled features of the Messiah foreshadowed in the Old Testament. So we have some particular passages that are referred to the most. So there was a question earlier about how do we know which passages do in fact refer to the Messiah and which passages don't. These passages seem to very clearly refer to the Messiah. Sorry? Oh, I? We should be on letter I, sorry. Yep. Oh, sorry, we are in H. Yeah, page 3 of 9 at the top there. Here are some of the most commonly referred to fulfilled features of the Messiah foreshadowed in the Old Testament. One, that Jesus, or the Messiah, would be a descendant of Abraham. He would be of the house of David, meaning he would be a descendant of David. He would be born in Bethlehem. He would be taken to Egypt. He would be anointed by the Holy Spirit. He would perform miracles. He would preach the good news. He would enter Jerusalem on a donkey. He would die a humiliating death in which he would be rejected. He would be betrayed by a friend. He would be beaten. He would be pierced with his hands and feet. He would be crucified with thieves. He would have no broken bones. He would be buried in a rich man's tomb. he would rise from the dead, and he would die a humiliating death as part of that, and he would ascend to heaven. And then the last one is a duplicate. You could delete that. But he would die a humiliating death, ascend into heaven. And so there are passages there, if you noticed in the Old Testament, in this list that we just went over, and in the New Testament. So we could look at every single one, and I was actually going to do that, put all the scriptures up there for you. But I think that it's something where it's worth your time to just go look these scriptures up yourself and enjoy that whole process yourself, because once you start flipping through the pages of the Bible and you actually look at these prophecies, it's a pretty amazing experience. So I definitely recommend you doing that journey on your own. Yes, Chris in the back.
Quick question. How, like, who sets that standard? How do we know that that's a messianic?
Okay, right. So scholars talk about this idea of dual revelation when you're doing Bible interpretation. So dual revelation just means that there was a meaning that was directly given and intended by the author for that Hebrew audience. So when David is writing Psalms, or when Isaiah is writing his prophetic book, he is writing with an intended audience, with an intended message that he's trying to deliver to that particular audience in that place and time. And that context is very important. But that also has a dual revelation aspect to it, where it's also significant for Christians because we realize that it has a second meaning associated with it. So Chuck Missler, if you've heard him on the radio, Koinonia House Ministries, they do an incredible job at understanding these nuggets of dual revelation in the Old Testament. And I highly encourage you to check him out. Now, Missler tends to be extremely well-versed in more symbology than most scholars, and he talks about all of these numbers and symbols and gives certain significance to things that many other scholars wouldn't. So he tends to take it maybe a little too far on some things, but he's a great Christian scholar and leader. So, yeah, John, yeah.
So the Messianic prophecies, maybe they are 200 or 300 prophecies. Can we categorize them into prophet, priest, and prince, or the king?
Maybe. It might be possible.
Those are the only fundamental characteristic of Messiah, prophet, priest, and king?
Yeah, those are the essential characteristics of the Messiah. Yeah.
Essential characteristics.
Yeah.
That means shepherd, judge, or other role.
I think those are roles that are more secondary in nature. And when we talk about Messiah, in terms of his messiahship, they're extremely important roles in terms of his divinity. You know, when he's expressing his divinity back then and in the future, the judge expression will be extremely important. But for the messiahship, it's more prophet, priest, and king. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward, and more, I think, will come to light. Now, there's a big old table in your book there that is provided for you, that also is repeated here on the screen. And essentially, this table provides more of what we just went through about him being betrayed, you know, and born in Bethlehem and of the lineage of David. This gives a bit more along those lines. Now, the top here, it's titled Old Testament Scriptures That Foreshadow the Coming Messiah. The left-hand column, the Messianic foreshadow, and it's paraphrased here, so I'm just saying in a paraphrase there what is happening in that scripture in the middle column, where the prophecy appears in the Old Testament, and it's written again between 1450 to about 430 BC. So this is at least 450 years or 430 years before Jesus. And then in the right-hand column, Jesus' fulfillment of the prophecy in the New Testament, written between 45 and 95 AD. Now, I know many of you, again, are familiar with this from previous experience in church, However, it's good to really get familiar with it because I think it's a very, very valuable thing for our own personal faith, to strengthen our own personal faith. And so if you look at these, there's pages, I've given you pages of these prophecies. You have everything from Messiah being born of Abraham's seed, to Isaac's seed, to Jacob's seed. He will be like Moses. He will be the Son of God. There's a crucifixion experience talked about in Psalm 22. The Messiah will be hated without a cause. Messiah will be given vinegar and gall to drink. I'm just skipping through a few of these, highlighting some important, interesting ones. He prays for his enemies. He will be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. He will be accused by false witnesses. Just kind of jumping around here. He will be heir to the throne of David, obviously in a figurative sense. He will make the blind see, the deaf hear. He would be preceded by a forerunner. Of course, that's John the Baptist. The Messiah will be beaten, mocked, and spat upon. The Messiah will be killed. He will be rejected. He will be silent in front of his accusers. He will be buried with the rich. All of this is in Isaiah 53, a beautiful passage that's extremely significant. Messiah will be crucified with criminals. He is part of the new and everlasting covenant. The Messiah has 2 missions. He will be our intercessor. He will be slaughtered. There will be a slaughter of the innocent. He will come at a specific time. We'll talk about that in a moment. And just on and on. And so I think these sorts of lists are valuable and important because there are so many. And when you start realizing how many there are, you start realizing how almost impossible it is that a human person would actually be able to fulfill all of these. And so again, you start to then see the hero nature of Jesus coming to light. The hero that we've expected and wanted, who satisfies our existential longing. And these lists, if you will, even though they're long, are very crucial in driving that point home to us to build our faith that this is more than just a man. He's more than just a man. There's something heroic about him. Now, let's go ahead and look at the responses to the challenges that the first challenge that Jesus fulfilled these prophecies by accident. So if you think about how someone could fulfill these by accident, that's kind of hard to imagine, but let's look at that real quick. So this Jewish Christian theologian says that, talking about whether or not this is possible that someone would fulfill this by accident, he says, not a chance. The odds are so astronomical that they rule that out. Someone did the math and figured out that the probability of just 8 prophecies being fulfilled is 1 chance in 100 million billion. That number is millions of times greater than the total number of people who have ever walked the planet. So that's pretty interesting. If you put it out in numbers there, this is what it looks like. 100 quadrillion, essentially. That should be 10 raised to the 17th power. It's not raised to the 17th power, but that's the idea with the zeros, 17 zeros or so. And this is an extremely low probability that someone would be able to fulfill 8 prophecies by accident. Okay, so we're just talking about 8. Now, why 8? Because we think that there are 8 prophecies that are so clear and relevant and truly do point to this Messiah that they cannot be denied by any reasonable person. Sorry? 10 to the minus 40th? Yeah.
And the physics is 10 power minus 34, which is actually anything below 10 power minus 34 is absolute. So you don't have anything to talk about.
Yeah, okay, so, right, so there's an impossibility threshold that once your improbability gets so high, it's impossible that these prophecies could be fulfilled, or this thing could occur, manifest in the natural world. So you're totally right. Dr. John has a PhD in physics, believe it or not, so that's why he pointed that out to us. For more on mathematics of improbabilities, please consult John after the class. He would love to tell you all about that, and he's a lovely guy. So now it's true. When we do the scientific apologetics class, we talk about what's called the universal probability bound. And this is a limit for all of the activities in the universe that have happened since a Big Bang, if you're a Big Bang theorist, and this is put together by secular and Christian scientists. They say that if you think about all the possibilities of all the electrons and protons and all of these atoms and how they move and where they move, you add all that up and you multiply it all together on what could have unfolded after the Big Bang, the chances of there being life on Earth essentially are well beyond the universal probability bound, this impossibility threshold. And so when you talk about the anthropic principle and whether or not life on Earth could be possible, you're dealing with these statistics and these improbabilities. So yes, it's true. Once you reach a certain improbability, you pass the point of no return, and it's clearly impossible. And this is well researched. And so this happens just with 8 prophecies. Now, in that list, in the table I gave you above, there are probably 50, 60, 80, 100 prophecies. And I wanted to show you another list of prophecies, again, because I think lists are important. This guy still has not started talking. Good thing we didn't wait for him. Yeah, it's impossible that he's going to start talking. Yeah, so, no, okay, we can maybe play it from here, but what I wanted to show you was Jews for Jesus. Oh, look, they're actually using the Jesus Factor Fiction website on this Jews for Jesus website. I was just going to show you this, and if you go to jewsforjesus.org, and then you go to this Answers tab, there's a pull-down menu that shows this prophecies of the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible. So if you click on that, okay, and it'll take you to this website within, or this table within, that gives you a big list. Here, 365 prophecies. Click on that. And this is not where I got my list from, but it's essentially a similar list. And this list has 365 prophecies. I don't know how many I gave you there on that table, but this is incredible when you're talking about 365. So we were just talking about the improbabilities of 8 prophecies being fulfilled. What about 365? And of course it's not opening because you guys are streaming music or something. This is very bad. I mean, here we go, look at that. Okay, so this is this list, and it's just huge, where you have the Old Testament prophecies here, or the Old Testament passages that have a dual revelation nature to them, and then the New Testament passages here. Somebody's hacking the system. Oh. I don't think she'll respond. I think this is a joke. We'll see if she does. Okay, so actually we've got to move on. We don't have time for these distractions. Okay. See what happens when you go on the internet? You just go on all these distractions. Even when you're teaching a class, it just doesn't matter. Okay, so the next response that we want to respond to, or next response we can give to the challenge having to do with Jesus intentionally fulfilling these prophecies. So in the New Testament Gospels, you see the Gospel writers say that he did this so that this would be fulfilled, as if Jesus was walking around doing these things on purpose to make sure that everyone knew that he was the Messiah, to kind of like make it happen, conjure things up on his own. So in response, we can say, first of all, that he could not have been in control of his birthplace. No one can control where they're born. If he could control where he was born, then he's God. Okay? Right? If he can't control where he's born, then this prophecy, cannot be fulfilled by accident. Now, or on purpose, because on purpose he's God. So, time of his birth in history, his parents, his ancestry, miracles, and the 30 pieces of silver Judas betrayed him with, and the method of execution, and the legs remaining unbroken, and the soldiers gambling for his clothes, and the resurrection could not have been fulfilled by accident. So, there's certain things that will not satisfy or stand up with the accident charge. Now, interestingly, Daniel 9:24 through 26 is a prophecy of the exact time when the Messiah will show up, and Jesus was born about that time. So this is quite fascinating. When you look at Daniel 19:24 through 26, you see quickly that there is a timeline given, and I wanted to turn your attention to the handout. It looks like the 77s. Daniel 9:24 through 27. Now, thank goodness for you, you came to a little school, church Bible college here that is all about Messianic Judaism, and they have a lot of resources in the office that I was able to appropriate here for this class, this being one of them. And this came from a class given by HaDavar Messianic Ministries here, and it's called the Book of Daniel, where, again, all of these resources are provided for free on hadavar.org. And it's really good material. And I could pass this around. You could flip through it. It's a nice big old outline binder here. And it has a great discussion in the middle of it on this paper right here. This paper has a nice diagram for you. And on the back side, there's a little bit of a discussion about it. Now, if you want more, there's a way to interpret and exegete, which basically means interpret Daniel 9:24 through 27. He has about 10 pages of outline on exegeting that properly and how this table is derived from his exegesis. So if you want those pages, I would encourage you to email the assistant here. She can probably PDF them to you. Her email is in the first pages of your notes and outline. It's really cool. So this gives you a really nice take on the timeline given in Daniel for Jesus coming, or for the Messiah coming. Now, if you read it, it says there are 70 weeks, and then 62 weeks. So it sounds like Messiah is coming fast because he says weeks. But weeks is a very poor translation. It's supposed to be 77s and 67s. And what he's talking about are years. So when you add up all the years, see it says 77s right there? 7 times 7 is 49 years. And 62 sevens is 434 years. And all of that points to this time where Jerusalem is going through all this trouble, and then you get down to the second region here, and then you have the Messiah coming at 30 AD, the death of Messiah, and then at 70 AD again, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans, which we talked about earlier. And so then you have after that this whole time of a new covenant coming to the forefront. So this is outlined for you in this graph. You just need to go walk yourself through it, read that passage on your own time in Daniel, and if you want some of the hermeneutics behind it, you can just cruise up here if you want after class and check out some of these pages. You can even take a photocopy, if you will, or a photo with your camera. And then on the back side, again, you have a discussion and some other passages there talking about the gap between week 69 and 70. So just very, very interesting stuff when you're talking about interpreting the Bible and then arriving at the conclusion that Jesus came when the Messiah was predicted to come by Daniel. And that is pretty awesome. Okay, so we'll go ahead. Any questions on that before we move to the next response? Wayne?
There's 365 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Now, when you add one, that more than exponentiates the lack of probability that it would happen. Right?
That's
It's
right.
more than exponential.
Right. Yeah, so when to do the improbability thing, you take one improbability, you give it a value, a numerical value, and then how you do it is you multiply improbabilities. So for each improbability, it's multiplied to the other improbabilities. So that's how it grows so fast. And that's just basic statistics and math, yeah. Okay, so let's move forward here. So the final challenge that we'll look at is that Christians ripped off passages out of context from the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, to use them to prove that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. So this is what some critics say. So we can say, for one, see for yourself, read the Old Testament, and ask what person matches this profile. Has a person like this come already, or is he yet to come? So this obviously isn't a very long response, but it's something that I think the non-Christian needs to just do for themselves. We can show them these lists of prophecies that have been fulfilled, but I think if a non-Christian is just willing to sit down and look at the text themselves and see if Christians stole that or misread it or misinterpreted it or didn't come to the text with the right hermeneutics, then they need to look at each passage for themselves. I would encourage you, if you're talking to a non-Christian, to point out the big 8 or the ones I gave you before the big table. There's a list of them there, and give him those. I would also encourage you not to bring up Psalm 22, because Psalm 22 has some really good stuff, but I think it could be a stretch to take Psalm 22 and use that as a messianic prophecy or a type. It could be a stretch. I'm just saying it's controversial and debatable, so why bother? Don't go to Psalm 22. Stick to all the other ones. If you use Isaiah 53 and you use the other ones I gave you before this table, outside of Psalm 22, you have more than you need for your own personal journey. I think Psalm 22 is interesting, but I'm going to withhold judgment on that, and I don't need it to enhance my faith. I have all these other prophecies. Let's go to the back. Andrew.
I have a question
Yes.
about typology.
Okay.
There's basically like foreshadowings in the Old Testament. Can people use that as a defense for Jesus? Basically, or are those incredible is what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, the foreshadowing. Yeah, I definitely think so. In fact, if you go back up to this list I gave you at the beginning, I think I gave you 9 actually. And then the die a humiliating death has a whole bunch of other ones underneath that. But the first 9, I mean, those are really compelling. I think there's the types and foreshadows are there. And yes, we definitely want to point those out. I'm not quite sure. I think some of these are types and foreshadows, and some of them are explicit prophecies. So yeah, we want to use the types and foreshadows, but not all of them necessarily. The 365, someone could start saying, well, this one's stretching, this one, yeah, I think Christians, you're taken out of the context. Hey, fine. Let's use the minimalist approach here. Let's be skeptical ourselves and see what we can come up with. If these 8 are all we need, then that's fine. All the other ones we can just say, we can withhold judgment on as being ones of dual revelation. So it's a minimalist approach because we're trying to not produce a straw man argument for skeptics to easily cut down. We want to produce an argument that stands up to our own scrutiny if we scrutinize it ourselves before we express it. That's the best thing to do. Yeah.
Well, I don't know exactly how to word this, but with God in the form of Jesus, which I I mean, God is the same yesterday, today, forever. But it's now that the triune Godhead shifted.
Right. So that's an interesting question. When Jesus became man, when the Logos, the second person of the triune God, was incarnated, did something happen within the eternal unity of the Godhead? That's a great question. We'll talk about it when we talk about the divinity of Jesus, because it takes a while to unpack that, because you have to look at what the early church did with this divinity of Jesus. How did they make sense of that in the monotheistic culture they're brought up in? It's not an easy answer. Yeah, it's really not. But it's a great question. Yeah, and we will touch on it. Other comments, questions? John, yeah.
So Christophany, is that the foreshadow or that's
Yeah, Christophany. Yeah, that's a great comment question there. So who's heard of a Christophany? Oh, many of us. John, do you want to explain it?
So the Christ appeared in the Old Testament, for example, Melchizedek, who gave bread and wine to Abraham. Sorry? Oh yeah, so yeah, other way. Abraham gave bread and
The-
Melchizedek, he appeared to Abraham and gave bread and wine, just like Jesus did in the New Testament. And Abraham gave tithe to this
No.
Melchizedek.
Yeah.
So that was in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. So no one knew about, he just came and flashed back. But it was repeated in the book of Hebrews. The Hebrew author was also saying that is Jesus, he's trying to represent that is Jesus.
Yeah.
He's explaining more.
Very good, yeah. Did everybody catch that? Okay, so essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but what you were saying was when Abraham paid tribute to Melchizedek, it was a foreshadowing in this special way, this Christophany way of Jesus that came before or came after and essentially made that manifest in a very special way. And Hebrews talks about that, yeah. And there's other different moments, this Christophany moments throughout the Old Testament that are essentially the foreshadows, but theologians use that word to explicitly say that this is definitely Jesus right here, being foreshadowed. So it's a very explicit sort of thing that theologians point to.
Other occasions, like the fourth person in the fire of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the fourth person.
Right, okay. Yeah. Right, and I think there's another one in where, so there's two different things going on. One is the foreshadowing thing, and one is the actual Jesus, or the Logos, coming on this planet like an angel would, showing up here. And this happens in the Old Testament, I think, 3 different times. And there's one, I think, that has to do with Abraham and Lot. There's these figures showing up. This figure, and I think there's 3 of them. So it was Jesus, the Lord, and 2 angels with them, essentially. And then there's another one. Joshua, yeah. Thank you. This is great. Awesome. We get so much more out of it when you guys give us your knowledge. Jacob wrestled the angel. I'm not quite sure that was Jesus or that was the Logos. But yeah, that came to mind.
Samson's parents, too.
Samson's parents? Okay. The angel that showed up there? Okay.
Glorious man, Daniel saw.
Oh, yes.
It says he wrestled with the Lord, and that was the name given Israel when he struggled with God.
Yeah, that one's interesting because I think it does talk about angel there and the Lord at the same time, so it's kind of not, it's a little unclear. Right. So there's some things to think about there. But with beyond that, yeah, it's pretty fascinating where you actually have the Logos coming to the earth before he does in the incarnation. So that's pretty cool. Okay.
He was there with, let us make man in our image.
Yeah. I mean, he doesn't necessarily have to be on the planet when God is kind of doing that, but yeah, he's there in a sense in the Trinity. Okay, so just to conclude, the evidence leads us to demand a verdict in the case for Christ, that Jesus alone matched the identity of the Messiah, that Jesus proved that he was the Messiah by fulfilling prophecies, and it's Jesus or no one. If Jesus is not the Messiah, then no one will be. So this is very important for us to keep in mind. It's a one-time sort of thing. And with that, I think we should just conclude and end this class discussion. And the only other thing I'd point you to is that there's a couple other handouts I gave you. One is just a little quick timeline of Jesus' life in relation to the John the Baptist ministry. Also, if you could put your name on the attendance form, we'll pass that around. And if I don't have your email, just give me your email. If you didn't give it to us last week, give me your email this week, even if you've given me your email in past classes. If you gave it to me last week, that's fine. I don't need it again. But if your name's not there, put your name on the back page and put your email next to it. The other thing I'd like to show you while that's going around is this last handout here. It just is a couple ways to think about the prophecies of Jesus. And essentially, there are certain categories of prophecies. Those that deal with the first coming, those that focus attention on the second coming, those that blend predictions of both comings in a single picture, and those that present the entire redemptive career of the Messiah. So there's a list there for you as well, providing a graphical format. All right. Any other questions?
Which timeline do you agree with? Because they're different.
Like I said, in the last class, I don't agree with any of these timelines because they're all slightly different from each other. So, I mean, it's like you just do the best you can, you know. No one knows exactly when things exactly happened, but we do the best they can. Other questions? Yeah, Caroline.
Are there any uncanonized books that contain Messianic prophecy from your research?
I don't think so. That's a good question. I'm not aware of any. Possibly, but I don't think so.
The Hindu Vedas, they are actually talking about the Messiah. There's a lot of prayers for Jesus. The Messiah was born out of virgin. The prayers.
How many centuries ago?
There are several.
Right. So I forgot to bring that up. Thanks for reminding me. There is a group within Hinduism that is trying pretty well. They're doing a good job of showing that Jesus is one of the Vedas, right? And that Jesus is just one version of a Veda, and that he has fulfilled prophecy. Yeah. And let's go to Andrew. You had a question?
I was going to ask, some people say, Moses is a type of Christ. Abraham was a type of Christ.
Yes.
What does that mean exactly?
That's...
This was a better version of, Moses.
Yeah. I think I'd rather state it that way than the way you stated it at first, because it's hard to say that somebody in the past was like somebody in the future. You know, there's a teleological thing happening, I think, in the Old Testament, that there's a purpose involved to get to Jesus, and that each famous character in the Old Testament is exemplifying some characteristics that Jesus eventually also exemplifies. So I'd rather put it that way. Yeah, Wilton.
They're deliverers, but not redeemers.
They're deliverers, but not redeemers. Yeah. The idea
They're a
of...
type of Christ. I mean, Christ is God. And Moses was not God, even though he was a deliverer.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jesus is also a deliverer, but he's got this specialness to him as a deliverer. He's ultimately the Redeemer. Yeah, Carrie.
When referring to the type of Christ, the term type doesn't mean like kind or sort of Christ. It means like a representation, like a little piece of something that
Yeah.
represents it.
Yeah, a foreshadowing of some sort. Yeah,
We have two different meanings of the word type in English, and people often think it means one and not the other.
yeah. Last comments, questions? Okay, would somebody like to close us in prayer? Chris, thank you.